welcome to this month's edition of Incidentally Informed. Today I'm joined by a fantastic group of panellists. Our topic for this month is the most common mistakes when responding to a cyber attack. My name is Louise Jose and I'm the marketing coordinator at CyberClan. I'll be guiding you through this webinar. Firstly, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to CyberClan, who we are and what we do. So over the years, CyberClan has helped thousands of clients through cyber incidents. We also offer risk management services, managed security solutions, and incident response services across the globe from our head offices in the United States, United Kingdom and Canada. This enables us to offer global services to the victims of cyber attack, but also industry partners alike. So today we'd like to kick off the webinar with a poll, which we will pop up in front of you. There you go. So if you'd all like to take a minute just to pass your votes over the questions that we've got below, that would be fantastic. We'll give you a minute to do that. Fantastic. So the majority of you, thank goodness, have not experienced a cyber attack. That is brilliant news. And again, quite a lot of you actually do have an incident response plan in place. But it appears that a few of you are actually in the process of doing that. So hopefully we can help answer some of your questions regarding those. Quite a few of you, again, don't use a managed security services provider or are looking into it. And oh my goodness, right, yeah, a lot of you do have multi-factor authentication enabled on your network. However, the people that don't, we would suggest that you get that implemented as quickly as possible. So as soon as you get off this webinar, that needs to be your #1 priority. Okay, we will bring the poll down now and I will introduce you to our wonderful panelists. So, there we are. Hello, everyone. Today I am joined by Tony McAvoy, who is our IT restoration specialist here at CyberClan. Fidem Kamili, the breach response services manager at Beasley, and Colin Battersby, who is a member at McDonald's Hopkins LLC. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Thank you. Also, if you could actually offer a brief intro to who you are and what you do, that'd be fantastic. Tony, should we start with you?
Thanks, Louise. As I'm Tony McAvoy, I've been with CyberClan since February this year, and I work in the Post Breach Remediation team. It's basically our sole purpose is to assist clients and customers in restoring their infected and affected networks and environments.
Thank you, Tony. Fidan?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fidan Karimli. I'm Beasley's Breach Response Services Manager. As a Breach Response Services Manager, my job is to help the insured, guide them through the incident, make sure that they are aware of their resources that are available for their policy, and answer their questions they may have throughout the incident.
Fantastic, thank you. And Colin?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Colin Battersby. I am a member in the data privacy practice at McDonald Hopkins. I get involved in breach response as what is commonly called a breach coach. So I'm coming in and bringing legal advice to advise, based on what's happened in the system, has there been a compromise of protected information that requires us to notify individuals or regulators, and then ultimately helping with the compliance issues there. Also making sure that I engage all the vendors that come in so that everything we're doing is cloaked in the attorney-client privilege. That can be valuable if later regulatory or civil matters that may arise out of one of these incidents.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So we will be taking questions at the end. So if you do have any questions that arise during the course of our discussion, please feel free to enter that into the Q&A section, and we will try and get to them at the end of this session. So talking of questions, my first one, when faced with cyber incident, it's very easy for clients of ours within our experience anyway, for panic to take hold. What are the main pitfalls initially in the initial hours after an attack has occurred that you've come across? Colin, should we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. One of the first things is a desire to get out and say something about what's going on. You want to communicate immediately with employees, with stakeholders in your business, customers you're going to ship to or not ship to, as the case may be, and that can be a situation that's fraught with peril, both in the immediate moment, and then having some looking forward to what we might be considering from a data privacy standpoint later. The truth is that you rarely know very much about what's going on besides the fact that you're incapacitated in some way when one of these incidents first occurs. You don't want to be saying anything that's inaccurate, and then you have to ultimately walk back later. That is going to cause some lack of confidence in what you have to report later. You can sort of share your panic with others and then involve other businesses who are now aware of something that they wouldn't yet need to be aware of, who are now breathing down your neck and wanting information about what's happened in your system that you're just not prepared to develop yet, or you don't know yet. So it's important to really bring in the resources from the outside that deal with these things on a regular basis to start getting a picture of what's going on before you start making any statements, and then being careful with when you do know a little bit of something. And this is not to say that it's mum's the word. There are going to be circumstances when you have to say something because you're not going to meet a requirement that you need to meet, or your phones are down, and you have to say something to quell panic, and just not because you're not available. But you have to be careful with what you say and when you say it. And so you want to make sure you're running these things by the resources you can bring in who deal with this all the time to make sure we're staying on point and not getting ahead of any message that may not be accurate. And one of these things, if you're ever in the unfortunate situation of talking to me in the context of a breach, you're going through a situation like this, I actually just did it as a faux pas. It's not a breach until you've actually had a compromise of protected information. You can have a ransomware attack that takes you down for weeks, and it's not a breach. It's a security incident. It's really only a breach when you've had the compromise of protected information, so a name in combination with a social security number, driver's license number, financial account information, et cetera. And that's, I'm considering state law in that answer. There's other sources of law to define a breach. But you don't want to run out there and say, hey, we just had a data breach, because you haven't yet. And even if you do, you don't want to be starting your clock. You can have a regulator say, well, wait a minute, you announced on this day that you had a breach, right? And breach means something. And you don't want to, and therefore, our 30-day notice provision, we're going to say start it here. We want to put that out as far as we can into the investigation, actually know what we're dealing with. So, first mistake is getting too talkative and running out when we don't know anything. Don't quite know enough yet to talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you for that advice. Fidan.
Yes. So another thing that typically we run into when the insured is going through an incident, as Colin said, security incident, and these can be different types of those. So any insurance, rationally, obviously, they would like to be back up and running as soon as possible. And it's a place that they've never experienced before, so they're just a little bit concerned about the whole situation. So they would like to be operational as soon as possible. The key here is as soon as possible, and that sometimes can be damaging actually to the insured when they do not realize that during the incident. Because so most of the insureds typically will have some kind of a master services provider or an IT consultant that could be external. And what they typically will do is we'll just ask them to recover to the machines that have been infected from the start, without having done any forensic investigation or without having contained the situation, without realizing that those machines, even sometimes the threat actors would get into your backups, which also would be infected. So even if you have viable backups and you're trying to recover, you are recovering from an infected machine to an infected because there has been no forensic conducted on either of your entire environment. So it's something that the insurers do not realize, that maybe they may be running back up and running in the next couple of days, but they can get back to being in the same situation again very soon because proper forensic hasn't been done, proper containment of the situation hasn't been done. So it's something that early on has to be thought that the speed, although understandably insureds have different liability for their clients and business operations, speed does not have to be the key, the first thing in responding to an incident. There are different factors that need to be kind of considered, and one of them is having properly, again, cleaned out machines, the environment, making sure that there is nobody else in your environment, but the allowed access before starting recovery and rebuilding again your system.
Fantastic, thank you. Tony?
One of the key things is really to restrict your network and shut it down. So shutting off your wide area network straight away to prevent any further instances of attack from the current threat actor or anybody else coming in. Aligned with that as well is actually to switch off and disable your firewalls in relation to that, so there's nothing coming in, nothing going out. But also a review should be had in terms of if you have any other trusted domains that are linked via VPN to different sites or different parts of the organization, which could be overseas, for example. So it'd be a case of cutting those links to ensure that the ability, the availability of the threat actor to move across from your own network to another trusted network is mitigated in that respect. So clients tend to leave it up. A lot of them too tend to actually switch everything off, but some actually do tend to leave it on until the actual damage done is actually worse than if they actually had switched it off earlier.
Okay, yeah, that's quite worrying, isn't it? Okay, so once the initial frenzies died down, we can often see mistakes occurring during the actual forensics and restorations efforts as well. Can you take me through what you most commonly see? Tony, let's start with you.
Yeah, there are a number of things. Changing passwords. So if you are beginning to recover or your Active Directory has been unaffected in that respect and you've been checked and verified, one of the key things is actually to reset all the passwords. Now, obviously, it's very dependent on the amount of users you have within the Active Directory sphere. But strong recommendation from us is that you always reset your domain, your local, your service, and your admin passwords as soon as possible, whether that's on-premise or whether that's in Azure or any other platform in that respect. We do have clients where they have thousands and thousands of users, and I think a compromise needs to be had in terms of, I think we advise people to disable the accounts and actually then re-enable them with some form of actually internal authentication. So if Dan, for example, was one of the users and her account was disabled, then obviously somebody from the IT side would go, right, for Dan, can you clarify who you are, confirm this detail, and then obviously then the account can then be re-enabled and a password sent for her to be able to log on again. What we found is that sometimes accounts are missed or not even considered. I find out a lot of clients do have a lot of accounts that are in a disabled state or are no longer used and are open to potential breaches or attacks in that respect via that method. Another thing as well is restoring servers into an infected network. So the advice is once the attack has happened, you should consider your current environment as to be red. And when we mean red, we mean you don't touch it, you leave it alone, you cut the network, you leave it as it is. And the sole purpose of that network then is actually just to capture forensics, but then also if there is a need to actually retrieve data from there or whether we get the data from the backups, is then to move that over to a clean environment. But what we find is that some clients do restore into the infected network again, whether they overwrite over the top or whether they actually start creating brand new virtual machines or physical machines in the same subnet and also domains as the actual infected network.
Okay, cool. I can imagine having, you know, a network with thousands of passwords. It could be quite off-putting having to change them all, but obviously it makes sense to do so. Colin, what would you say from your side?
So, you know, and I know our presentation here is called Common Mistakes When Responding to a Cyber Attack, and not all cyber attacks are ransomware attacks, but a lot of these days it does sort of seem like most of them are. There's usually a threat actor involved, and I guess there's probably always a threat actor involved in the cyber incident. There's frequently a threat actor involved who we need to interact with and figure out whether, you know, they've taken data and if our information is encrypted, what's the price for that? We like to use experts who deal with these groups on a daily, well, multiple times a day basis that have aggregated stats on how do we deal with them, what's their likelihood of responding to certain offers, where are we going to get them down to, and we sometimes come into situations where, understandably, a business owner has reached out to that threat actor already and started communications, and this is a bit of a hostage negotiation, right? If there's an actual live body hostage negotiation, we're not handling that. The FBI is, right? So there are experts to deal with this thing who regularly deal with these people, and there can sometimes some of these groups have short fuses for the negotiation. So you'll get a ransom note, and the ransom notes almost never say this is how much the demand is and this is how much time you have. There'll be a URL to click into on a Tor browser to message with them and start the negotiation. Sometimes clicking on that link is really like the start of the clock. And you don't want to be starting that clock on your own. You want to be letting that be a discussion we have with folks who are expert in this. There are also ways that these criminals need to be approached, and we want to work with people who are well versed in doing that and who can start that conversation. It can be difficult at times, though not impossible by any means, to sort of transition the initial communication chain to the experts once they get involved. We don't want to let the threat actors know that you're dealing with a professional when there's been that transition, because they're smart enough to know, okay, they hired an expert, they have insurance. So all of a sudden the price of poker has gone up. So it's important to bring those folks in from the beginning, let them set up the chain and the negotiation and the posture that they're just one of your IT consultants who's never done this before and needs to be treated with kids' gloves, kind of thing. So that initial outreach can if started early without consulting with experts and bringing in the negotiators, can start clocks and can start a process that may ultimately result in perhaps a higher ransom payment, perhaps some agitated threat actors who you don't really want to be dealing with. So ultimately, fight the impulse on that. You got to bring the people in that do that. If it's a day or so before that actually happens, you're not really going to be set back. Your business is obviously, you want it back up and running, but from the negotiation standpoint, it's not going to impair things to make sure we bring the right people in to do that from the outset.
Brilliant. Fidan?
Yes, to Colin's point, absolutely. So when I'm on the phone with the insured on the very first call, sometimes we'll hear things such as, well, it's just, they hear ransom and ransom negotiations. They believe that that's the only part of the ransom negotiation. So they'll have their IT department or like their MSP doing the negotiations. What they don't realize typically is that the experts that we rely on, well, first of all, the insurers don't realize, unfortunately, that they have that resource available under their policy. In most cases, that's one of the reasons why insureds purchase cyber insurances, because they would like to have some kind of a cyber extortion laws. And under that cyber extortion laws, they'll have resources available to them to hire proper experts, like Colin mentioned, that would assist them through the negotiation process. But typically, negotiation process involves a little bit more detail than just negotiating with a threat actor. There's an involvement of understanding and identifying who the threat actor is and whether they are in U.S. government sanction list, whether the insured is even allowed to make the payment to them in the first place. Having done that compliance check is crucial from any perspective, basically for the insurance business, for the insurance that they have, they would like to be reimbursed at the ransom for the ransom payment that they made. And also so there are different types of threat actors, and not all of them, they all have different MOs. Some of them like to steal data, so exfiltrate data. Some of them like to just encrypt. And the proper experts try to find out as much information, as much intel from these threat actors as possible. So the priority is not only to get the money down to a certain amount, is also to find out what kind of data they have, if any, what kind of threat actor we're dealing with to begin with. And these things are all available just only if the insured wouldn't click that the Tor link and started the process. And then there's a 24-hour, for example, ticking clock, and then in a way, they are rushed, understandably, to find the resources available within an hour, which becomes sometimes quite challenging to do. And also the threat actors are sophisticated as well. They do understand the transfer of a conversation from one, from one person to another, because again, proper experts, they have their own ways of negotiating, their own communication styles, and so keeping it seamless as one side, one party conducting those negotiations, conducting those intel gathering would be much more beneficial for the insured, as opposed to starting the conversation, then transferring it, and then just creating a little bit of more mess and ultimately delaying the process, as opposed to what it would have been if they just reached out to us a little bit earlier and gave us a chance to kind of go through the process with proper resources.
Fantastic. So do you guys also find that, obviously if you've got an insurance policy, realistically it's probably best to follow what your insurer is telling you, and to utilize the resources at their disposal as well, because obviously Fidan, companies like Beazley have done a lot of the work. They've handpicked the people that they work with, that they employ to do IR and so on. So and forensics for that matter. Would obviously if you were hit and you've gone to your insurer, you're going to supply those resources, aren't you? Do you also find that sometimes people have actually started the restoration effort or the forensics effort before they've even interacted with you?
Yes, not often, thankfully, but there will be cases where I will be contacted 10 to 15 days after the ransomware or the cyber incident has actually taken place. And having gone back retroactively, trying to figure out what happened and who the forensics, who has done the forensics and who was the privacy counsel, or if there was a privacy counsel at all. There are so many legal implications to it that Colin can mention that I'm not even going to go into, but just from the perspective of, there's a big misunderstanding, I believe, from the insurance side to the in the cyber insurance industry, that because we do have panels, approved panels that we work with, and we typically recommend them, that there's some kind of a gain for us. In fact, those panels, such as different forensic vendors, legal vendors, the ransom negotiators, they've been vetted by Beazley and I'm literally on the phone with same vendors 5 times a day for a different matter. So they actually do know what they're doing. And when I listen to, I'm on a first fact call and I'm trying to figure out what happened, I try to pair them with a proper vendor that I think that would be a great fit for them, as opposed to having MSP who can be amazing at providing regular IT consultant services. Probably might not be the best idea to do the forensics for a lot of reasons, if not one that typically outsiders would look for an independent third-party forensic specialist conducting those investigations, and not someone who is actually internal or someone who actually already is on a retainer with an insured. So there are different reasons for why it would be great to the second some kind of a cyber incident occurred, to just pick up the phone or an email the claim, and then somebody, if it's a ransomware, typically one of us is on the phone as soon as possible, and we're able to kind of listen and see what happened and then respond to it and triage in a proper manner, versus having conducted the recovery and then just coming to us 10 days later when things are a little bit convoluted, and it takes just as much longer to figure out what happened, so I can provide, based on what happened, the next steps. We could have saved everyone a lot of time if again, I was aware of the claim earlier and I could have provided services. At the end of the day, those services are already purchased by the insured, so my services are already in there. Why not use them? Why not utilize them? They have them.
Fantastic. Yeah. So Tony, one of the other questions that I had was, do you also find that instead of just disconnecting the entire network, that you also see customers possibly just powering down their servers instead? What sort of implication would that have on the restoration efforts?
think a lot of our clients that we actually deal with, they do tend to, once they notice they've got something going on, they do tend to power everything off. A lot of the advice that we're giving out at the moment is actually to disconnect all the network cables. So if you've got virtual servers, virtual hosts, network appliances, just unplug the network cable from the back and leave them running. The reason for that is because our forensics teams are very, very keen to actually see what's installed, what's been captured in the live memory of those devices, because from that can give us some really, really good clues and indication about how the attackers have actually entered the actual network, whether they've gone through a particular device that's not been patched, or it's through a particular virtual machine or physical machine, or even via a particular server like an Exchange or something else similar to that. So by having that live memory available, it's very, very useful. Now, every client is different, and it depends on when the actual claim comes through to us from the insurer panel, because there may be at different stages. We might be capture it right at the beginning, or we might be like 2-3 weeks in, where they've been trying to sort things out themselves, or in with some other vendors in terms of before they've gone through their policy. So it's just very much dependent on what we actually see in front of us. But trying to gain that information from a forensics perspective is very, very useful. So whilst it's the best practice to actually power everything off, just disconnecting the network cables out the back, but also disconnecting your WAN as well and leaving those boxes on is going to be advantageous. I think also going back to what Fidan was talking about the MSP doing the forensics. So the MSP and the IT teams from the clients are important. They will work hand in hand in terms of actually obtaining those forensics with the IR teams that are involved from the insurance perspective. So they will be very, very handy in terms of actually getting it for us, because that will be very useful in terms of actually reviewing and finding out how they managed to get in. Are there any clues? Have they left anything behind? And is there anything else that we can actually look at? And from that also will determine as well some of the aspects of restoration and the security of the network. And so if we highlight and pinpoint a particular entry point, then obviously that's something that we can address, even though we'll do a full coverage check of all the network appliances, the hosts, the virtual machines, and everything that constitutes part of the environment.
Thank you, Tony. That was really helpful. So from your experience, do you have any examples of customers who haven't followed best practice during an incident? And what were the cost and reputational ramifications that followed?
I can start. That's fine.
Yeah, you start.
Yeah, that's fine. So yes, there've been a number of things. So my colleagues have dealt with a particular client where they've been attacked 3 times. So the first 2 times, same thing happened, and they didn't listen to the advice given. And on the 3rd attack, they then heeded that advice. The reason why I don't think they actually listened the first 2 times was the impatience to restore, and they restored back into an environment where they shouldn't have done. So if they actually listened to the advice that was given them first off, then there may well have not been any other further claims down the route. So it's weighing up in terms of how much is it going to cost you in terms of an attack compared to how much it's going to cost to actually repair. Because obviously looking at your environment after an attack is going to either bring up some issues where you have to review your hardware, your software, your MFA, everything else that's aligned to that. So obviously there are cost elements to that. Some of the clients that we deal with don't have that money. They don't have an abundance of money to actually spend and secure the environment. One client that I've dealt with earlier this year, they actually restored into the red network. And the reason why is because they didn't have the money or the resources. We built a clean green network for them to use when they're ready to use that. They had an EDR tool installed for the duration. So that was handy in terms of having those machines restored into the infected network. But purely they were constrained by budget, personnel, and other reasons for not being able to spend the designated amount of money on securing the actual network and environment. One other client, they got hit by Hafnium earlier this year. So that was resolved by doing the relevant patches that Microsoft released. And then later on this year, they got hit by ransomware. They went through a process of resetting all their passwords. They missed one mailbox password, and the threat actor was trying to attack through that. Fortunately, at that time, the EDR tools on there and detected that. So in that respect, that's handy, but then it just showed that if we're advising in terms of actually resetting all your passwords across the board, domain, local service, and admins, then it's important to do so. There's a question come through or on the chat, what's an EDR tool? It's endpoint detection response. So basically it's a tool which can be installed on servers or on endpoints, desktops, laptops. And basically it is like a antivirus on speed in terms of actually just ensuring that it detects any malicious behaviors. So if you are attacked by a particular malware or something along those lines, then the EDR tool should actually pick that up as well as your AV. The AV tools are good to a point, but having an endpoint detection response tool on top of that and that availability gives you that added layer of security as well, in terms from a behavioral perspective. And one of the things that we tend to look for is that a lot of the clients we deal with have very flat networks. So they tend to not have the segregation that we would actually suggest strongly in terms of actually making sure that your key core systems are really set away from everything else and that you have dedicated virtual local area networks assigned to app servers, database servers, and so on. But the increasing the amount of layers of security within your environment, yes, it could be costly, but it's going to be it could not compromise, but it could actually prevent you from actually doing a lot of work very, very quickly, but it's there to protect your environment. So it's a case of when we actually engage with clients and we work with our third parties to help people restore, we give them that this is the correct way or the best practice way that we should actually look at. Some do take that forward, others take it partially, and others dismiss that, saying, look, we haven't got the facility or the capability to do that. Yes, we would like to, but we're being very much dictated by the client in terms of what they want and what they want to achieve.
Brilliant, thanks, Tony. All of that was really, really helpful. Fidan.
So another thing that usually, Tony a little bit mentioned on it, seeing repeat insureds or seeing repeat customers, unfortunately. And there may be different ways how this basically happens, that we see same insureds for different claims. Like Colin mentioned, when we're thinking of a cyber attack, we're automatically kind of tend to think about ransomware because that's the highest threat at the moment. But we don't realize, sometimes insurance don't realize that the business email compromises are just as important, because that's typically the most threat actors weigh in to your environment. So if an insured has experienced business email compromise and hasn't taken precautions to remedy the security practices that were offered, that were kind of suggested by the forensics, typically what will happen is a couple of months later, we'll see the same insured, this time filing a claim for a ransomware incident. Many threat actors like to use the path of least resistance. So if you do not have an MFA, for example, it's just as easy to compromise an email account within an environment and then laterally move to your network and then deploy a ransom payload. So typically, there are things that can be actually rectified and can be prevented. MFA is not absolute. We also understand that, but just as how easy would have been to have the MFA in place, have proper maybe Outlook, Office 365 licenses for the email accounts that are actually, they have, their admin accounts or their important accounts that they do contain certain sensitive data. So sometimes we'll have a ransomware, we'll have a business email compromise, but with no logs. So not having one lead to another, I think following the best practices, following the, if an insured has gone through an incident the first time, learning and taking as much from it as possible, rectifying the incident, and then being a little bit more proactive can actually do wonders. Not seeing that insured again in the next couple of months. Unfortunately, because business email compromise doesn't carry that same weight at times, so when an insured goes through that, they're back up and running. There's very little business interruption laws involved in here, so it may not sometimes be taken as seriously, which may lead them become an insured with us or filing another claim with us again. So yeah, little things do have a much larger implications. So please have MFA, please, and then follow the security practices that are usually typically offered to you at the end of the forensic investigation can do a lot.
Brilliant, thank you. Colin. Oh, can't hear you.
Sorry, yeah. Mute. You gotta have, every Zoom presentation has to have one person talking with the mute button on, right? So you're all welcome. It was me. I have a scenario that really covers a lot of the bases of what I've been talking about so far, about some of the errors, and names have been changed to protect the guilty. But a scenario where a client first contacted me, they were about five or 6 days post ransomware attack, and they had done what I think is probably the first thing that people think to do is, let's restore our backups. We have good backups. We're going to just get everything back up and running. We're going to be back to business. We're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars being down, and we're going to roll it back out there. They did have good backups. They did restore from those backups. Unfortunately, they wiped every single thing out, all the evidence that we would use to identify, what information might have been compromised. How did the bad guys get in? There was not really a whole lot of effort put into remediation. And by remediation, I mean figuring out what was the door that they exploited and closing that, right? So when they talked to me, I was pretty candid with them. There's not a lot I can advise you on from a legal standpoint, except that the group that you're dealing with, is known to take data. You have sensitive data on your network. We're be hard pressed to say it was, only this part. It's basically everything that you've got is in play because you've wiped out the evidence. And no one wants to hear that, and no one wants to go and notify their entire, client base, current and former, to the extent they've collected PII. One of the reasons we wanted that forensic investigation, because, you can say, well, yes, they got in and yes, they did things, but we might be able to say, well, they only interacted with this portion of our network. And so that's not everything. That's actually a fairly limited amount of information. So we're going to actually have a relatively contained data breach or a small data breach. Here, the issue was that they by wiping everything, we aren't able to make those types of interpretations and legal calls. So they did not ultimately engage me. They went forward with their restoration and notifying their key contacts that there had been no compromise of data. In truth, there was no evidence of that, but it's because they had wiped it all such that it wouldn't have been discovered. It can be a bit of a dangerous game doing that when you have a group that is known for taking data and then posting your name later on the dark web. So we'll look at that again in a moment. So fast forward a few weeks later, get a call from the same prospective client. They're dealing with a new ransomware attack. And they are down and they are trying to restore again from backup. And I say, guys, let's pump the brakes here. This didn't go quite right the last time. We're not sure whether this is the same attacker or somebody else who just exploited a different entry, or the same entry for that matter, because they never did find out how they got it the first time. Ultimately, we did find that they're likely a different group. They may have acquired the access from the other group. Bad guys will do that. They'll sell and trade access to networks and the like. But we're now in a situation where they previously hadn't closed the door. We have a new threat actor in there who is claiming to have taken some data. We're going to end up having to notify individuals likely, or at least business partners. When we talk about notification, I regularly am thinking about PII from a state statute standpoint, but many businesses have contractual relationships, BAAs in the case of in the healthcare industry, engagement letters or outside counsel guidelines in the professional services realm, which require you to notify contractual partners about these things. And those can frankly be more painful than the PII notices, because you end up having the entities you're notifying, their security team wants to come in and interview your security team and talk to your forensics, and then you're dealing with a whole lot of other people besides yourself. So now we have a new attack here. We have folks that have been previously told that there's no evidence of their data being taken, and we're getting to be right around that stage where the group that was in there the first time tends to post data when they haven't been paid. So some communications went out that may or may not have been right, because they were just kind of doing the best they could with what they knew, but they didn't know what they didn't know. There's no malice in this story at all. There's not anything that they were trying to mislead. But ultimately, there's a situation where names are going to be posted. It might undercut what's been previously communicated. And you know, had we been in and done some evidence preservation and, you know, deployed that EDR that Tony was talking about, we would have, you know, caught that firing off of the second attempt there. Could have investigated and really had a real picture on what happened, and we weren't able to do that. And so it's you know, there's a self-inflicted mess there to a certain extent, and you know, we could have prevented that. So that's a cautionary tale.
Thank you all for your examples. Tony, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just on the back of what Colin mentioned about, we do have every client's different. It comes to us at different points in time. So we have a couple of clients where they've completely flattened the network and rebuilt over the top. I think one of the key things as well that sometimes our clients and customers don't realize that you can get hopefully a detailed report from your internet service provider if they're good and they offer it and they're not being stubborn in terms of providing it, in terms of the spike graph showing the amount of data going in and out of your network during a particular period. So one of the key things that we ask for now from our clients and customers is that they engage with their ISP to get that. And hopefully that can give some indication whether there has been a significant data going out of the environment at a particular time when the actual attack happened. And that's obviously going to be quite key in terms of that. And obviously then hopefully you have a breakdown in terms of if that's in relation to a particular IP address, which then can be linked to a server. So even if certain stuff has been flattened from a server perspective, that there are certain things that we can try and find out, but obviously it's kind of restricted when we don't have the full environment available when for us to take copies of the C drive or the relevant files that we need to actually obtain from that. Fidan mentioned about business email compromise. So we've had one recently where we advised the client about what we're going to try and do for them from a business email compromise perspective, but then I advised them quite strongly about ransomware because obviously we've seen it. And we gave a lot of recommendations in terms of both. And strangely enough, they haven't taken the advice and they switched provider for some reason. And it's a case of I think the people involved were, I don't know whether they're taken aback by the information, but if we don't have this stance where not being kind of blunt, but actually straightforward and open and honest in terms of, look, we've seen this before, we're here to help you, assist you and guide you. And through the whole process. Now, this is what we've seen week in, week out on what we do as a job. But just be rest assured that we're suggesting this because we think this is the best way, the best practice that you can do in terms of actually shoring up your environments. So using multi-factor authentication across the board, if you have a lot of web applications. Office 365, a lot of clients that we find haven't got MFA enabled. They've only got a small subset of those users enabled with MFA. Software as a solution services, which are hosted by third parties. MFA is not enabled on those. So there's been a few recently where we've had to engage with the client to actually engage with their third parties to ask the question. And they do offer that service, but they never offered it or they haven't found out about it. So it's really a case of just ensuring that current clients and customers, but prospective clients and customers actually look at securing their environment as much as they can, especially with multi-factor authentication, but also if you've got the budget and the money, then maybe invest in an endpoint detection response tool, and obviously constantly review your infrastructure. Is it up to date from a hardware firmware perspective? Has it got the right level of patching? So there's lots of things that clients and customers tend to miss, and really there's a lot of things that you can do prior to even being attacked or trying to prevent yourself being attacked by actually actively doing those on a regular basis.
Brilliant. We've had a few people in the chat as well as a couple of questions come in, which would be brilliant for us to cover off before we end the discussions here today. So Tanya's actually brought up something which we've mentioned actually on a couple of our previous webinars as well, and I think Fidan would be able to attest to this one. She says, we've recently been through all of this, so I'm really sorry, Tanya, that this has been something that you've experienced. Here were a few of our mistakes. Do not save a copy of your insurance policy on a shared drive. Our attackers found our $2 million policy and exploited that knowledge. Don't trust a single backup. Our Barracuda Cloud backup was deleted, which we had wish we had an offline backup. So there's 2 points there that I think you know, Fidan and both Tony could probably chip in there for. But yeah, we've seen that plenty of times here at CyberClan as well. The storing of important documents such as that within shared folders, and then the threat actor exploiting that. Fidan, is that something you've come across as well?
Yes, unfortunately, and I would add to that. Well, first of all, yes, I've had cases where the threat actor did actually reach out to us and asked for a certain ransom demand, and said that, well, I'm not going to lower my demand because I know for a fact that your insurance policy has an X amount $1 million, so please pay up. That's one. And then the second, well, it's not only the share drive, it would be your email address. So the threat actor that I'm referring to actually is known to get into your network through business email compromise. And if the email account is a compromise, they can also find that insurance policy with proper personnel, whoever is responsible for it. That's one. But I would also go one step further and say not save your incident response plan in a shared drive, because that's typically that's essentially you're inviting them to your playbook and just telling them this is exactly what I'm going to do. So when insurers reach out to us to review their incident response plan, they're like detailed 47 pages of a incident response plan, which is admirable and it's great. But the whole idea of an incident response is having something. Almost takes me back to my law school years when you had an outline to study for your final, and that was like 50 pages. Except what we didn't understand at the time, that 50 pages is not going to give you enough time to study for it. You need something that's like 1 or 2 pages just to have a trigger word. So having a condensed incident response plan for you and having it in a place that's actually accessible, versus in a shared drive where it's accessible, but it's accessible to the people who should not be in your network to begin with. So the point of an incident response plan, the point of an insurance policy, I know it's we don't do it anymore, but have a hard copy. Hard copies sometimes go a long way to understand what you're looking at, and then to understand how to respond to it, because you worked hard on it to be able to actually have its use at the moment. So yes.
Yeah, there you go. I think you just answered Kate's question there as well. Where should we save these documents then? The thing is that, everything is digital now. It's very tempting to keep everything stored in the cloud, stored on your network and so on, where you've got easy access to it. However, I was talking to another one of our colleagues recently who was saying you don't realize how secure paper and pen actually can be, and having a hard copy of something stored in a file on a shelf in the office rather than necessarily on your network. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. Regarding the backup side of things, Tony, obviously, unfortunately, their Barracuda Cloud backup was deleted. Again, is that something that you've seen within attacks such as this?
Yeah, we have on multiple occasions, unfortunately. The only thing I could say would be that if you have on-premise backup, that's one thing, and then transferring it to a secure cloud somewhere is another one. But then also having probably a tertiary location where they're completely off-site, where you can have access to them. But also it comes down to, have you got the money and the resources to actually have that? But I would strongly suggest, in terms of looking at different providers who offer that solution, in terms of that backup stored offline, off-site, but obviously with the caveat that should you experience an attack or an incident, that you can actually recover using those backups in a quick and efficient manner. Because it's one thing to have an off-site backup, but if it comes back very, very slowly, that can delay your restoration. So there are lots of things to consider with regards to having those effectively off-site backups away from your environment.
Fantastic. Tony, there's another question that's coming from Javier. This was something that I tried to sort of, I guess, allude to earlier on.
Yeah.
If you've got a company with 1,000+ users, how do you handle changing all the passwords of the users after recovering from an attack? Do you change and set a new password for all users, or do you allow users to set their own?
So it depends what you have in place. So you could either run it as a group policy where you affect that change, or if you have an SSPR, which obviously is a self-service portal for resetting passwords. It just depends on what you have. Some companies tend to have a password manager, but only for the admins and key accounts, but some do use that for their user accounts as well. So it's very much dependent on how you manage your passwords prior to an attack or an incident or an outage. It's probably good to actually review that and how you actually effectively allow your users to change their passwords. It's probably worth checking the policies out as well in terms of the character length, the complexity, the amount of times you should be changing your password on a regular basis. So default is usually around about 60 days, 90 days. So every institution, every company is different, but it's probably good just to have that active review to see how can you automate a lot of the stuff in terms for password reset, for actually setting down the actual conditions that you should be changing for it as well, and also the frequency. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no,
but it is tricky with a huge amount of users, and some clients have asked that question as well. And it's just a case of possibly some clients have said they stagger it, they'll do it in batches. So some have third parties that if you change the password, they're locked out of the systems, but they're still going to go down that route of actually actively resetting them.
Mitch has asked, MFA is being mentioned a lot, which is one good defense, but no one has touched on email threat security. Roughly 70% of viruses and malware are transported via malicious email. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Mitch. So yeah, MFA is a key security resource for that. I think one of the key things is education. So the systems are only as good as the people who are using them, or indeed actually embraced with them. So if you educate your user base or your customer base to actually detect where they think something is not quite right. So there's a lot of things out there. If you look on LinkedIn, if you look on Google, there's a lot of people out there who explain about some of the concepts about phishing and spam as well coming through. Not to click on unsolicited links. If it looks, it's very, very similar to an email from somebody that you know, it's worth just checking it out. So for example, had a client come through with an email where they added a couple of extra letters in, but if you look at it quite closely, you think it's the same. So if you don't actively look at that address where it's come from, that's the first thing to actually think this doesn't look right. Also having a good spam filter. So depending on how you actually secure the actual inspection of those emails coming through the systems, that's always a good thing to have. Something like Mimecast in terms of coming through and actually inspecting that, but also then having detailed packet inspection on your switches, which is a little bit more advanced. That will be able to detect certain things which aren't quite right with something coming through. So there are many things, but that's certainly a very good question. Thanks, Mitch. Hope that answers that.
Brilliant. We've had one through from B Downing. Any major differences in the types of demands you see from threat actors towards small businesses, less than 100 employees, compared to large organisations? And do you have any specific tips for small businesses? So Fidan or Colin, I think you'd be best placed to answer these.
Yeah, I can jump on that one. Yes and no. What you find with attackers is that they don't really target businesses per se. They look through the internet and find the open doors and they go through them, and then it's kind of a crime of opportunity. So sometimes they're ransoming in the blind, and they're throwing a large number out there. And that is where some of the negotiation can come in and say, hey guys, like we just don't have this. It's not even an option. Our cash flow has been hit by all kinds of things, or even when things are good, we don't have it. They are starting some group, and this is kind of group dependent too, by the way. There are some groups out there that have pretty small ransom demands, although they're vanishingly, their prevalence is certainly getting smaller. Certainly 6 figures is much more common anymore, and well up into the 7s at times. There will be pushback when we negotiate with them and saying, just can't, not worth it, can't do it. And they'll say, well, these are your revenues from the year based on your audited financial statements we pulled off of your system, or based on what's being reported out there. Small companies aren't going to have a whole lot of reporting going on there, and it will be, a negotiating point. But they can, I'll tell you, none of them are actually forensic accountants. None of them actually are trained in like identifying what your actual profit margin is. But they'll see things like, well, we see this money flowing through your business, and it may not be your business's money, but they still see it that way and think it's while it may be a pass-through amount to you, to them it demonstrates that. So it's sort of it's a tricky, it's not an easy yes or no. They do appear to try to size things up in some cases and negotiate with you based on those types of things at times. For small businesses, the tips are really what we've been talking about is the security issue. I have definitely had the policy show up in discussions a number of times, and so not keeping that where they can find that, because you can talk about revenues all you want, but if you have a $2 million policy they found, they're not going to care so much, and then your talking points have to shift to, well, thanks to all the harm you've done us, we have to use all of our insurance money to rebuild and notify people, etc. But then it's really the security, keeping them out, having that incident response plan to prevent, for when it happens, to prevent further penetration than necessary. Not that any penetration is necessary, but cap it off as best as possible. And really, when it comes to small business negotiation, it's using those experts who are used to that and can take those points about your revenue, about you being a small business, and spinning those into something that can be used to try to negotiate the payment down.
Wonderful. So we've got 2 minutes left, and we've got 2 last questions. So I'd like to try and hit on them if possible, rather than keep people waiting. Here's one now, quickly. Would an insured's failure to implement suggested remedial steps, e.g. enabling multi-factor authentication, impact any later claims on the same policy or a renewed policy?
Yes, and I can actually, I could see the first question, and I would say that question would tie into that as well. Why do you need to do forensic investigation? One of the reasons would be if you later on have a claim, we'd want to be able to see that you've done due diligence. And when we are looking at your second claim, so MFA absolutely. So is a lot more right now. It's just a lot more required because it's so easy to implement it, and unfortunately, a lot of insurers do fail to implement it. So yes, it's not so much when underwriters look at your policy or when they're writing the policy that they're not necessarily. We understand that it's not a matter of like if an insured gets attacked with cyber attack. It's not that. It's how you well handle an attack, how basically well you respond to an incident. So one of them would be if you did not have an MFA in place, and then you've gone through an incident, and the first thing that was recommended to you was actually enabling the MFA across all your endpoints and software solutions, and you haven't done so. The next claim that comes in after that, the very first question, we're going to look into that, and then when it's time to renew your policy on the underwriter side, they will be talking to me. They will be talking to anyone who responded to that incident into trying to figure out what the incident was and what the risks are. So yes, absolutely. And then forensic, it's the same way. There's different reasons. Colin mentioned a few of them why you need to do forensics, but from the insurance perspective, you need to do it because if you haven't done your due diligence and next time there's a second ransomware is happening, we're going to be asking that question, what has been done in the first one? Because we want to know if this could have been prevented or not. So definitely it's affected, yes.
I think that's the thing.
Yeah, and outside the...
Sorry, I was going to say, when people hear forensics investigation, I think they sometimes believe it's like trying to find out who the threat actor was rather than necessarily how they got into the network in the first place. And that's really what we're talking about when it comes to forensics is what their gateway was into the network and how they moved within it. So that's all stuff that then helps you shore up after the attack as well. Sorry, Colin, sorry to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, even outside of the insurance coverage context, I mean, that's exactly right, Louise. You got to figure out how they get in. And then from my perspective, what did they interact with? Because you may have a data breach. You may have a situation where they've taken current or former employee information, or if you collect personal information for customers, or if you're a healthcare company and you have OCR looking at what they've done, or you have a contractual relation with a healthcare company and you have to tell them, you need to be able to say, this is where they were in the system, this is what they were doing, because you may have obligations to report on that. You can't just sweep it under the rug and say we're recovering, we're not looking into that. You're on notice of a possibility of an issue. You got to look into it. So that's where forensics comes in. Find out how they got in, close the door, and then what did they do while they were there, and based on what they did, what obligations do you have? And you may have some.
Wonderful, thank you. So I hope that we answered all of your questions. If not, then please feel free to email into communications@cyberclan.com, and I'll make sure to forward those. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Louise. There's one question from Kate. I think she asked it earlier on.
Oh.
I'll quickly answer that if that's okay already. There's a conflict between disconnect network and don't communicate. Is it best to ask staff to stop working? Just to say there's an IT issue. There's a lot of pressure in 30 minutes. Yes, there is. It's important to prevent the attackers from actually getting further into your network, so disconnecting the network. When we say don't communicate, obviously you will communicate with your insurers, breach counsel, anybody else that's going to get involved, and then those specialists will then help you in terms of communicating. And I think Fidan and Colin can answer a little bit more, but they'll be there to actually instruct you in what you're going to advise your clients, your customers, and also your staff.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Tony. And that's a good point of clarification. Don't communicate does not mean we're not going to say anything, because we're going to have to say something. It's don't communicate off the cuff. Let's bring in people who know what we're and. Yeah, there may be exigent circumstances where you have to communicate to say, hey, shut this down. We're experiencing an issue, but let's keep it to that level until we can get in and talk about what our message looks like, what we know, and what we can convey at the time, and keeping it to a need to know basis. And sometimes the need to know is the company wide, saying, hey, we're having a network issue, we're investigating it, we'll keep you posted. But the point is to don't go rogue. Let's rely on the people that know to communicate these things regularly, so that you can put yourself in as best position as possible in a poor situation.
Yeah, I think being a marketing professional, I can say that and having worked in PR as well, it's definitely one of those things where you've got to control the level of communication, the language that's used. So yeah, definitely. So anyway, I think that was the last question, but thank you so much for joining us today, Fidan, Tony and Colin. Having you on this call was really helpful, and as I was saying, hopefully we have answered all of your questions now. If there are any questions that you have, if you're watching the replay of this over on our website or our YouTube channel, then please do feel free to email us at communications@cyberclan.com, and I'll make sure to get those questions over to the relevant person. We will be sending out the replay link after this webinar is over, and if you do feel that there are any colleagues that you have who would benefit from this, please do share it with them. Our next webinar is on the 18th of November, so please do look out for our communications around that and make sure to register as well. But as I've already said, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.